Hello and well met, folks. This is Laren with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. Happy holidays, and I hope that all of you are able to get together with your friends and family, maybe get a little gaming in before the holidays are over. I actually started a new job. I have to work Monday, and then I have the rest of the year off up until the 2nd, I believe. I have to go back for a couple days. So just a quick mention, if you are new to Fantasy Grounds or you're just returning after a long hiatus, just to let you guys know, there is a winter sale going on the Fantasy Grounds website. Quite a big amount of discounts, and this ends on January 2nd at 10 a.m. Pacific time, so early in the morning for some of you, or in the afternoon. This is a really good deal. I mean, most of the stuff on here is discounted quite a bit. So if you are looking to level up your library, or if you want to gift somebody, what you can do is you can purchase something on the store. So just for an example, I'm going to go take a look at the store. Let's just say I wanted to buy this Tales of the Red Cyberpunk. So if I purchase this, I can go into my order history and gift it to another user who has a Fantasy Grounds account. What I recommend that you do is you buy it separately. So if you're going to buy yourself some stuff, make that one transaction, and then make a separate transaction for perhaps your friends, or maybe you're a player and you want to gift your GM something. That's the best way to do it. If you do it where you combine everything, you'll have to get with customer service and have them separate the order out. They'll probably refund you and then just have you reorder the stuff you want. But just as a heads up, a warning, if you want to buy stuff for other people, you make them separate transactions from your own. And then also make sure that you can use PayPal, because some people have problems with PayPal. So there's not much we can do about that. But anyways, so yes, there's a big sale going on. That's just all I wanted to say on that. So the topic of the show today is hidden gems. Fantasy Grounds features. Maybe some things that you don't know about or you don't use, or those sort of things. So some of these are system agnostic, meaning that they can be applied to most of the core rule sets, and they're based on the core functionality of Fantasy Grounds. And then some of them are going to be 5e exclusive. So some of this information might be good for you, some not. Depends on what your favorite rule set is and what you're into. So first and foremost, I don't know if you guys use this or not, but for the longest time, I never used the quick start guide, because I just dove headfirst into Fantasy Grounds and I really didn't read anything or care. Also, there's a user manual which takes you to the Atlassian guide. There's tutorial guides, the forums where you can report errors or read about other types of things. There's the official Discord. There's some FAQs and a way to contact support. So this is a really quick and easy way to get to stuff without having to go into Fantasy Grounds or try to do a search online. I don't know how many times I've looked this over. It's right in my face, basically. If it was a snake, it would have bit me. So I'm going to actually load a campaign that I had previously started, which is, or did it earlier today to prepare for the show. But you can create a new campaign if you want. I'm going to actually just load this, which I'm calling the D&D 5e rule set features. This is the legacy, by the way, not the 2024 content. And then I do have a few extensions I wanted to show off a little bit. So there's the Joy of Painting, which allows you to stage assets and brushes and tokens and stuff in your campaign, so it makes it easier, so you don't have to keep digging through the assets or all your artwork. I'm also have the Pets extension. I think both of these are free. So Pets is so you can add companion animals, that sort of thing, vehicles, horses, so that way your players can control it easier, and it gives them the ability to move the token and advance the combat tracker and those sort of things. So it's helpful if you have like a druid or a ranger that has a pet or something like that. I'm using a custom free theme. This is by Vaz. He made this for the Fantasy Grounds Academy, so this will be theme for our colors and branding. And then there's the player agency extension, which I believe is free too. And this one is for world building. Fantasy Grounds in itself doesn't have really good world building tools, although they're trying to improve that a little bit over time. But I think this player agency gives you a lot more options. So if you want to build up locations and link things easier, it's sort of like that, so that it's a lot more intuitive towards combining information and giving players access to parts of it, and also having the ability to edit and create fields. Recently, they added a world function in Fantasy Grounds. So if you load up most of the core rule sets, there's like a world area, and that's where like stories go, quests, and also things are related to the campaign that are more like world building kind of stuff, or things that are related to the adventure. So they do have that, which was in they were preparing for Bastions for the 2024 rule set, but I think it's a core feature, so it'll probably be featured in most of the rule sets. So I'm going to go ahead and hit start, but I just wanted to kind of let you know some of the things that I have loaded. Now, I don't recommend using a lot of extensions. There's some of us out there that have been using Fantasy Grounds for a while that load up on these things, and they do all kinds of cool stuff, and I don't want to discredit the people who put a lot of effort and work into those. So it is kind of a catch-22 though, because you have to kind of maintain those when you do put something on the forge, and then they break sometimes. So if Fantasy Grounds has a major update, you might lose some functionality for a while until they can get it straightened out. So that's the cycle that you want to expect, especially if you use a lot of automation and extensions that are going to do a lot of different things. So I try to keep it minimal just for my own sanity. I just get really tired of chasing down updates and worrying if my next game is going to break, and all that kind of stuff. So I really try to stay away from extensions, but I'm going to show you some ones that are utility than automation so much. So that's kind of the ones I have right here. But there are stuff that does some really amazing stuff, like automatically sets up actions for you and that kind of stuff. But I'm not going to be featuring those because they're really not part of the core experience, nor are these that I have loaded here. But these are a little less invasive when it comes to Fantasy Grounds. So if these break, it's probably not going to break your game. So that's kind of what I try to steer away from. So I'm going to go ahead and hit start. And this is going to launch the Fantasy Grounds platform. As you can see, it takes a little bit to load, and that's simply because it has to course through your library in the back end. So it indexes any changes that were made, your modules, your extensions, your art assets. It just loads everything up. And sometimes if you have a lot of stuff, it adds a few seconds to it. But cleaning out and purging my Fantasy Grounds back, I took everything and put it in a shared drive or in a storage drive, and then it did help the load time a little bit. I want to say maybe by a few seconds. It wasn't really very noticeable. So this load time is something that everyone will experience regardless of how fast your computer is or how much stuff you have. So this is the themed Fantasy Grounds Academy extension that I have loaded. And what I wanted to showcase here are some features that may or may not be useful to you depending on how you run your campaigns and how you want things to run and how do you want things to go. So first and foremost, usually I lay out the desktop the way I want it to look most of the time when I'm going to play. So that's kind of how I have it set up now. And if you use a dice tower or the options up here on the top right corner, there is a campaign options. Now this will vary depending on the rule set and depending on if you add extensions or not. So mostly I wanted to show you that you can change your character color, and your players can do this too. And what this does is if you have a map or an image and you draw a pointer on there, it changes that so that you can know whose drawings or whose shapes are whose. So I'm going to open up the images and I'm going to look for some maps. So here is, I loaded some map packs here just so I'd have, some kind of reference here. So let me see what I have. So Amazing Maps bundle, that sounds promising. So here is an arena, and likely it already has the line of sight on it. So if you buy content from the Fantasy Grounds Forge or the official store, most of those will have line of sight. And that is the occluders and such. So let me unlock this and let's see what we got here. So I'll unlock it, and I'm going to go to the line of sight option, which is this brick wall. And as you can see here, they chose to put glass around the edge, which I think is a smart idea because that allows for players to be able to see everything still, but it makes it so they can't just go through the wall. And then they've actually added all this. Now, as far as the way that these trees are done, I don't know if I would have done it this way, but that's a quicker way to do it. But I would have made it look a little bit more natural instead of like a pillar. Because, I mean, these huts are actually round, so that kind of makes sense to do that. But for trees, they're a little bit more natural. And I think that these sorts of things are more choice and taste, but I don't think that represents a tree very well because it's just a round circle. So whoever did these was probably in a hurry, didn't want to spend a ton of time on it. I get it. I've done it myself. But when it comes to trees, I don't like personally, I don't like the aesthetic of having it a completely round circle. And you can kind of make these a little bit smaller so you can actually see more of the tree. Maybe just go around where the trunk is. So that might be more of a circle, but nonetheless, these are the kinds of things you'll see in Fantasy Grounds, various qualities of how things are interpreted and how people do the conversion. So they do vary a little bit, but it's not too bad. It's doable, it's livable, it's not the end of the world. So anyhow, that does have line of sight, so I wanted to make sure of that before I get started. And then if I'm going to right click on this and go to view, and I can go to zoom to fit, which is going to recenter the map. So if you get kind of lost in the toolies there and you got it all stretched out and you can't see certain parts of that, you can either right click on it, go to view and zoom to fit, or you can use this drop down menu. And let's say you're like this or something, you can actually expand it out with this shortcut up here. So those are very valuable things to know up here. You can also toggle to the 3D mode. So if you have the art and the tokens that support this mode, you can switch to that mode. There is a drawing mode. It's very rude or crude and kind of elementary. And then you have shortcut view. You have player preview mode, and then you have this navigation toggle, which allows you to move the map around with these navigation bars. You can also use the arrow keys unless you have it set up for something else. And that's pretty much the majority of moving images around. I think this is probably one of the features that most people have trouble with in the beginning until they get their bearings. So that could be an issue in the beginning days of your career with Fantasy Grounds, or if you haven't played in a long time. So the other thing is I wanted to show you in the options is that you change this color, and I recommend that you ask your players to do this, especially if they're spellcasters, because what this does is when you're on a battle map and you want to draw an area of effect, let's say, this will help you draw those without everyone having the same color. So this used to be tied into dice color. So if you played Fantasy Grounds Classic, if you change the color of your dice back then, it would also change your color of your active character for drawing these shapes, but now they're totally separate functions. So you do that in here in the options. You do it as a player or a GM. And then what you do is you right click, you go to pointers, and then you have different shapes. So you have an arrow that you can draw. And as you can see, it's yellow. That's the color I chose in the color picker. But if I come up here and I change it to light blue, it's going to change that color. So that's kind of how you can change that color so that you can kind of figure out whose area of effect is whose. And that's helpful if you have a big combat going on and you got several areas where spells are cast and such. So I'm going to right click again, go to pointers, and let's say you have radius, so you can left click and drag radius. What I recommend on this, and I think that this is a common issue for individuals that are playing spellcasters or that have area of effect or range type things. So I'm going to go to characters, and let's say I have this dwarf. This is Dorig Weirdbeard Rockfist, 3rd level cleric. And what I'm going to do is go to assets, And typically when players are building their characters, they're going to come up here, click on this, and then they'll pick their portrait through here. If you're the game master and you want to speed this up, and let's say you have a bunch of pre-gens, it's easier just to go to portraits in the assets area and drag them to the character sheet. And that this way, this doesn't dismiss the collection, because if you do it per character, every time you select a new portrait and you do it through here, once you select it, all this stuff goes away. That's kind of annoying. So what I like to do as a game master, players can't really do this, but as a game master, you can go through and you can keep the assets window open, which will have all of your different tokens. And these happen to be some custom ones that I made. And you can use these and you drag and drop them onto this dialog here so that you don't have to keep closing and opening that window. So I'm just going to use this custom token for now for my Dwarven Cleric, or you can use some of the assets that come with Fantasy Grounds. So it just depends on what you have access to, but all these are custom ones that I'd made over the years. So I'm just going to left click and drag, and that will actually add this as a portrait. If you want to use it for your token, you can do the same thing and drag it over here. And now you have a portrait and token. I don't have a 3D camera version, so if you have a character and you want to use the 2.5D or 3D mode, you'll have to come up with a full body image and then make a like a portrait for it as well. So if you want to do a custom one for characters, that's the route you'll have to go. So in this case, I don't have a 3.5 3D view asset for this, so I'll leave that blank. And I don't plan to use it anyway, so I'll go ahead and close this, but that's the quickest way to assign images to characters and NPCs instead of doing it through the character sheet. Because like I said, if you do it through here and you click on this button here and then you start digging through these folders, once you select it, it closes this, and that's really annoying. So I like to do it through assets as the game master. The players don't have a choice. They have to go through the character sheet, but as the game master, you want this to go a little quicker, especially if you got a bunch of pre-gens. You want to change out the artwork. It's way quicker to do it through here. So I'm just going to use this as an example for the spellcasting shapes. So I'll just kind of take this record and put it on the combat tracker. And then if you are going to be in a campaign or running a game or such, you also want to add this to the party sheet. So whenever you add combatants, like player characters, on the combat tracker, you also want to add them to the party sheet. And that gives you an overview, a top-down view of your group. So if you got more than, even if it's just one, you want to put it on there. This does not account for pets, companions, NPCs. This party sheet is only for player characters. So we're going to go ahead and close that for now. And we're just going to say that this color is for Dorig here. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to go into the characters here. I'm going to right click on the actual character, and I'm going to take ownership as the GM. So when my players connect to the table, they won't be able to claim this character. This will be my character that I'm going to use. Or if I wanted to reserve one character, let's say you've got 5 pre-gens, your best friend says, hey, I want to play the paladin, So I'll go ahead and right click and claim it, take ownership. So when the players join my table and they go to select the players, that one's out of the loop. So it won't be selectable for the players. Up here on top, you can actually toggle this view. You can go back to the classic view where it just shows the player characters, or you can switch to the tabletop list, and this will show your party and the NPCs, kind of like a mini combat tracker. And if you're somebody who streams like online, I would use this mode and then just capture this area and then display that somewhere in your OBS settings so that you can see who's up next. You can see the NPCs that are coming up. So it kind of gives you a better snapshot of what's happening as far as initiative, who goes next, that sort of thing. But while you're just in Fantasy Grounds or just playing around a table, I don't think this is necessary unless you just like the way it works. Because you can also pass the actual turns from up here as well. So if you toggle it to that view, that will help with that. So back to this thing here with the spells. So I'm going to take Dorig here and put him on the battle map. And what I'm going to do is we'll just say that this is a representation of his spell. So what I normally do with characters and NPCs, if you've watched any of my other videos, is I will stack them up in a pile next to the chat window, next to the combat tracker, so it's convenient. And then I'll go and I'll drag the initiative down here to the hotkeys. So if I was the player, that makes it easier for me to roll initiative. I just have to do it through this shortcut instead of coming all the way back to this sheet just to click that. One caveat to that is if for some reason your dexterity goes up, let's say when you level up to level 4, you pick a dexterity increase for ability scores or something like that, it might change this bonus, so you just have to redrag it. So anytime you put rolls down here in the shortcuts, you might have to update those occasionally, depending on if you have a magic item, maybe you have a potion, maybe you have a bonus that applies later on as your character progresses. So this, remember that dice rolls are static in this hotkey area. They're not dynamic, so if you level up, these don't level up with you. You got to redrag them. So I've had where I've played, several sessions, and I had somebody complain and says, "Why my initiative rolls are so crappy?" And I looked at it. They had a +2 bonus up here, but actually the shortcut they made was from when we first started, and they hadn't updated it in a while. So that's just something to watch out for with dice rolls in this shortcut area. So I also asked players to take and maybe put their first top 2 or 3 skill checks, so whatever rule set you're using. So in this case, since he's a cleric, I'd probably put, I don't know, medicine. That tends to be pretty useful. So I'll drag and drop that down here. Also, I might do insight, or maybe in this case, perception, because that's quite often, that's probably the most common one. And then maybe one other. So I don't know which one it would be necessarily. Maybe history, maybe insight, whatever you think is necessary for your character. But usually the top 2 or 3 is what I recommend for this. So if you're going to be playing and you're going to be a player character, this is really helpful to have this stuff down here instead of having to come to the sheet every flipping through these tabs while you're playing all the time. Once in a while is fine, but not every turn. The other thing is, if you wanted to, let's say, to advance your turn, I know players get they forget about this. When they're done with their turn, you ask them to pass their turn, they forget. So you can shortcut this next actor button or turn complete, and so you can also put that down here at the bottom. So that's very useful for the player side of things. And then most of the time when you're playing, you're going to be spending probably 80% of your play here on this combat mode on the actions tab. So these are just shortcuts, or these are my actual weapons, and these will be stuff we can use during combat. There's my spell slots. Here are all my abilities. And if you put your characters on the combat tracker, in some rule sets you have passive abilities that should be active all the time. So in this case we have Dwarven Resilience. So that gives them resistance to poison, and it gives it a note to roll advantage on saving throws versus poison. This isn't automated yet without an extension, but it at least gives you a reminder. So if I click on this button here, that's going to apply it to me. So I will get the resistance, which is basically half damage from poison. But if I fail, or if it doesn't resist, I also get a saving throw versus the condition. So that's something that you can basically click on advantage before you roll the save. So that's what this is, basically a reminder. So some effects or some automation is still manual, but you can put notes in there to make it easier for you. And then here are some of the other, I don't have too many other things that I can add, but one thing I do on characters that have shields. So for instance, if I want to use my Warhammer in a two-handed manner, which is going to give me more damage. So if I click this to 2 hands, I get this. But technically, you don't get the shield bonus. So if you come back to your inventory and then you have shield, it's equipped right now. You're supposed to come over here and unequip it before you do anything with your, and then re-equip it if you're going to go back to a single-handed use. But what I did is just made an effect that just cancels out the bonus. So I just click on this, and all it does is do -2 on armor class, and that's just a more of a convenience thing for me. So, or for a player. So if they click on that and they use their weapon two-handed, that's fine, and it kind of cancels out their shield bonus. But once they're done, if the player adds this themselves, they can go to the effects button and take this off. So that's a quicker way to handle situations where you have to use a shield and you don't. But I think in Pathfinder it's different. They can raise a shield. It's a little different, but in other rule sets it may not even apply. Like Call of Cthulhu, you probably don't use a shield. So it just depends on what rule set. But these are just little things that you'll find that you can do in Fantasy Grounds to make your experience a little bit easier. Now back to this thing here. This is just a way to show an area of effect. So I'm going to actually right click, go to pointers, and remove all the pointers, or you can remove just this one. I'm going to remove them all. So as a player or a DM, you can remove the pointers by going right clicking and going here, and this will clear everything. So let's just say on his turn, on Doric's turn, he wants to cast the Bless spell. So you have the Bless effect, which will essentially add concentration. And what we're going to do is we're just going to apply it to him since there's no others on the map right now. So that does the effect, plus it adds a concentration tag, which will trigger an automatic save if he receives damage. So during combat, when his turn comes around, he's maintaining the concentration on this spell, but if he takes damage at any point, whether it be from spells or melee, you have to roll a constitution save per the rules, I guess, and it's not the same for all rule sets. Like this is for D&D 5e, but it will automatically roll to see if you maintain the Bless, which is a really nice feature, because when I first started playing, I didn't even really know about that rule, and when I saw that roll, I was wondering, what the heck is that for? And then I realized that concentration spells require a save if you take damage in most cases. So that is a nice feature. You can turn that off or remove this little letter C if you want the player to do it themselves, because some people like doing that and they don't want the game to automate it. So it just depends. But these are just little things that really makes Fantasy Grounds useful for tracking, for gameplay, and giving you reminders. And it's nice to have this text up here because your players can see what effects they have on and any notes that they've applied. So we're going to cast a Bless spell, and if you click on the description, it tells you it's range 30 feet, so you can bless up to 30 creatures of your choice within range. Whenever a target makes an attack roll or saving throw before the spell ends, a target can roll an additional d4 and add the number rolled to the attack or the saving throw. And you can also cast it at a higher level. So that just, in this case, just allows you to use it on more than one instance or more than one player. So you can add an additional person to your Bless. But in this case, we want to just worry about the range or the radius. So this is 30 feet range. And what I would do is, depending on the spell description, I would draw out the radius if you're worried about where it's going to be impactful or where it's going to help. So I can take and right click on the map, go to pointers, go to this circle, and just click somewhere not on your character, but maybe off to the side initially. So single left click, hold down the left mouse button and drag this out until you get to 30. And then what you can do is take the center point and move it. Let's say that's the area of effect. It's easier to do it that way than trying to do it on your character right initially. So I usually draw it off to the side and then I'll move it where it needs to go, depending on the situation. So you might have players in this vicinity. Now I don't know if it would, if you had a player behind this area, I don't know if it would take effect. I don't know if if it's one of those spells, the description might say, individuals that you can see. If it doesn't say who you can see, then it would apply. So it just depends. This one doesn't say. It just says up to 6 creatures of your choice that you can see. Okay, so there you go. So if you can't see someone behind this wall, they shouldn't get the bless. But there's nothing to automate that. That's just something you have to learn about the rule set. So this is just like just one thing that I like about Fantasy Grounds is it's pretty utility. It has a lot of functionality in there. But some of these things we don't use because it either doesn't come up in gameplay or it's not very useful at the time, or maybe it's clunky. Like some people may not like this. There are people who have made modules that actually have like a bless artwork, and if you activate the extension, I believe, and then you use those spell tokens, when you drag it into a certain area, it also applies the effect. You can kind of get really fancy and automated. Problem with those, though, is those tend to break quite a bit. So anything that's really good tends to break, as far as I know. I mean, it's not always, but a lot of times when you get something that's that cool, it seems like those are the ones that break the most. So anyways, I'm going to go ahead and right click on it. And when I'm done with the spell, or you no longer need to know the area of effect, I'm going to go to pointers, and then I'm just going to remove it. So this is something the player can do once they're done with the spell. Now, I don't know why that did. Oh, it's because I was in the middle of drawing something. Let's go to pointers and get rid of all of them. So another thing you need to know is that if you're going to move tokens around, when you're in the map settings, let's say you have this thing here and you have it unlocked, you have to be in play mode. So if you're not going to be able to move the token. And I've come across that. It says, why can't I move the token? So if you're like in this line of sight mode, you can't interact with the tokens because they're on a top layer. So if you go back here, then you can move it. The other thing is, let's say you have to move, like if you're going to move it standard, you can't move through a wall, and that's by design. However, if you're the GM and you want to be able to move the characters around without having to go through the entire map, you can hold down the shift key and drag the token through the wall or through the structure so that you can move it. So that's just something you'll learn through gameplay, is holding shift and dragging the token. So that allows you to go through walls and that sort of thing. And it's only for the GMs. The players don't have that option. So that's a nice little feature. Let's just say in the beginning of your campaign, you want to convey a message or perhaps a recap, or maybe even just some notes for your players when they join the table. So if I go to the options up here on the top right, and you go to message of the day, this used to be an extension, but now it is part of Fantasy Grounds. So you might say, like, last week, maybe there's a little summary. And then what will happen is that you can drag links in here. Like, let's say there's a map that your players were on. Whatever you need to put here, you can link stuff here, you can write it. But what this does is you can take this information, and when your players join the table and they claim their character, it will pop up and give them this message. So this is a nice feature that you might use occasionally if you're interested in that and you need to pass a message to your players before the game starts. You can do something like that. And like I said, you can put links in here. Like if you wanted this map and you wanted it to be available to them as soon as they join the table, or maybe it was last week's map, you can drag and drop images, like shortcuts like this, and this will give you the ability to do so. So if I wanted this map to be shared with them, I could do something like that. So this is kind of a nice little thing, and I believe this is a core function. This isn't just for D&D 5e. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. Let's go back up to the options. There's some other things in here that are helpful. So when I first logged into this particular session, I was able to recall the state of everything that I have loaded here, and it comes back to where I had it. So this desktop here where you actually have restore windows on start. By default, that's off. So when you first start a campaign, that's off. So you want to come in here in the beginning, turn that on. And what happens is when you actually exit Fantasy Grounds, maybe you crash, maybe you know, come back a week later, you're going to go back into that, and it should be where you left all your windows. So if you had a bunch of stuff going on, that will allow for you to recall, and that way you don't have to go back and try to remember everything you had going on. So you might have a map open, maybe you were in the middle of game prep, whatever it might be. That's a very handy tool. Again, that used to be an extension that was rolled into Fantasy Grounds a couple years ago or less, and that was a lot of functionality added that was needed, because it used to be called Windows Saver X or something like that, and you used to have to keep all the windows open, and then you could designate which windows open, I believe. It got kind of fancy, but then it broke and it wasn't useful for a while. And then Fantasy Grounds actually pulled that. Smiteworks pulled that into Fantasy Grounds. So here again, we have the back to where we were essentially. So I want to open up the options again. And if you want to change the background decal like I have here, you can click on here. And if you don't want one, you can actually just click use empty, and that will get rid of the artwork. In the beginning, when you're learning a new spell system or a new game system, it's handy to have like a cheat sheet in the back here. So if you wanted something that details combat or gameplay, you can make your own graphic, or you can take something out of your rule set, make it an image, and then use that as the background decal. So you can have information right there on the desktop if you need it, or you can use a map. Let's say it's a world map of where you're exploring, whatever you want. The decals are kind of fun. They can be distracting. I tend to not put them up here unless it's important. The only reason I had that branding up here because I'm doing a Fantasy Grounds Academy thing, but during a game I wouldn't have that up. Normally I'd probably put like a cheat sheet up here, maybe an image of the next area that we're going to be adventuring in, whatever it might be. So that's something that you can do if you want to. Let's see. There are some other really cool things that I wanted to show you. So options for the rule set are kind of rule set dependent, depending on which game you're running. You know, which like Pathfinder, or if it's Starfinder or whatever. So these change a little bit, but there are some things that might change. That might be universal to Fantasy Grounds. So the desktop show dice tower, that's fairly universal. You turn that on, you have a dice tower option, and you can actually right click on it and move it. So I'm going to move it where I want it to be, which will be here. And I'm going to kind of adjust my character sheet to accommodate that. And that way, if you want to do any hidden rolls during gameplay, you can ask your players to, maybe you want them to do a perception check, or perhaps it's a check that wouldn't necessarily reveal what the player is doing. So mental things, perhaps. So if I go to my skills, let's say insight. That's not really something you would roll out in the open. So what I would do is have the player drag this +5 for insight into the dice tower, and this would be a hidden roll. Only I could see the result. So he rolled a 25, he rolled a 20. So he could probably tell something, or somebody was lying very well with that roll. And you can describe it like, yeah, that guy is full of crap. He's lying. That sort of thing. And you can even tell this guy's a habitual liar. So this is something you can do for storytelling. But if you roll something like that out in the open, it kind of changes the way your players might respond. So if I just have the player drag this over to the chat window and it displays here, if I roll a 1, the players, which I did, that would be an utter failure there. So players would know that, and they might respond or play differently if they knew the result. So if I ask the GM, hey, I want to see if this guy's lying, what do I pick up on? If I roll that 1, the players are going to know automatically that that's not going anywhere, and they might change their tactics. So if you roll it in the dice tower, then they're not going to know, and you can kind of control the narrative a little better doing it that way. Or the player themselves can just say, What is it? What is this guy? Is this guy lying? And you could just say yes or no, or roll it into, or kind of roll it into your narrative. So you don't always need a dice roll. But this is just an example of the extremes, that why you would use a dice tower in the first place. The one caveat to that is if you have this activated, if you do want any hidden rolls as the game master, you have to roll those in the dice tower as well. So if you don't have that turned on, it'll automatically be hidden unless you change the options. So that depends on what you're trying to do, type of storytelling you do, all that sort of thing. So just as a, kind of a heads up, kind of a gotcha type thing. There's some things in here that might be useful, like party vision and movement. That's off by default. And what that'll do is, let's just say I'm going to bring up an NPC. And the old way of allowing players to control an animal or an NPC used to be like this. So I'm going to show you the vanilla way, and then I'm going to show you the pets extension, which kind of expands functionality. So I'm going to get let's say we have a pet wolf, which is pretty common, and we put that on the combat tracker. So by default, this wolf would not be controllable by the player, because it's actually the faction for it's an enemy. So it has to be set to friendly. The other thing is you'd have to have on party vision of movement, has to be turned on, so that the player has access to the token and they can move it around on the map. So if, for instance, your player accidentally closed that last map that we're on, if I double click on the token, that should bring up the last map they were on. And then I'm going to drag this NPC wolf onto the combat tracker. Now with it, if I have this on, this actual option, party vision movement, the player will have access to the token, and once they click on it, they can see through the perspective of that token. The problem with it, it's universal. So everybody in the party can see through each other's vision. So that's the only thing I can think of that would be kind of clunky. But this is the old vanilla way to handle that. So what you could do, if you want to keep doing this without extensions and you don't want to, is you can actually take this particular situation, party vision and movement, you can turn it, you can drag and drop the on, and then you can click it to off, and then you can click that also. So you have two different toggles, on and off, and you would only turn it on when the NPC is active. And once they're done with their turn and they advance, or you would have to advance the combat tracker, so you just turn it off. And that kind of keeps it so it's not always on, but that's really clunky. So an answer to that, and I hope that this gets rolled into Fantasy Grounds at some point, because not every rule set needs pets and companions, or they doesn't necessarily support it, but I think most of them do. Like I can't think of any rule set that you wouldn't allow someone to have an NPC or an ally. So an answer to this is, first I'm going to go back to the options. I'm going to turn that off. So I don't want party vision and token on. I want to turn that off because I'm using an extension which doesn't require that. So if I go to this, it's off now. I don't really need these shortcuts anymore, so you can right click and delete those. But I just showed you the vanilla way of how to do it. So what you can do here is you can take an NPC, such as this wolf, and you'll have a little tab that's created by the extension called pets. You have a spot for vehicles, you have a spot for pets. So if I click on this green plus button and drag this wolf NPC record, that is now going to be my pet that I can control. And then from here, the GM can drag it to the hotkeys. So I can't use the same one because this is the initial one. And what I'm going to do is drag this onto the combat tracker. It's automatically shared with the player, and it gives me the right to move it, and I can advance the combat tracker, and only I, as the player, can see through the eyes of this wolf. So that's how that works. So that's a really nice feature. I really hope that gets incorporated into Fantasy Grounds so we don't have to keep using it as an extension. It rarely breaks, but if there's a major update to Fantasy Grounds, like something that changes the theme or where the buttons are, anything like that, it probably has to be updated. So that's the only caveat about using extensions, is that they often will break. Hopefully not too much more in the future, because Fantasy Grounds the last 6 months has made a lot of changes, and they changed the way that the platform is performance for images, which is the last one that broke a lot of stuff. And then before that, they changed the actual way it looks, like all these buttons up here changed, all that kind of stuff. So when that happens, it breaks the extensions because they're based off the older version. So that's the only thing I can think of that would be annoying. But I think this is one of my go-to extensions if I'm going to use any, especially if you have a druid or a ranger or some sort of NPC, or not NPC, but some sort of character that has pets, or maybe just a horse. And you see there's a place for vehicles, so maybe you have a wagon or something like that. So this gives you the control as a player if necessary. And it's per player in this case. So if I had another character, they'd have their own set of things they can control. So that's just a really nice feature. That's not native or core to Fantasy Grounds, but it is a free extension on the Fantasy Grounds Forge. And any links or things I'm talking about in this video should be linked at the end of the video in the description on YouTube. So that's just a useful thing. The other thing I wanted to mention was your assets over here. If you're going to be opening and closing this window all the time, I recommend that you take this asset button and put it down here in your shortcuts. So that alone keeps you from having to reach over there. And if you have it collapsed, let's say you needed more room or you didn't want this to distract you anymore, and let's say you can actually make this smaller over here by using this little arrow. So if you have this collapsed down to where you don't want to see that, you want more room for your maps and such, you can shortcut a couple of those. So now I can just click on the assets key here, and I don't have to go through the menus anymore. So it's handy to have a couple of those shortcutted if necessary. And then what I'm going to do is go to the home key. But if you click on home, that resets which type of asset. So it goes to all. So in this case, I'm going to go to images. And then if you had images that you wanted, let's say if you're building a map or something like that, or you want to add some more assets to a map, I have another extension on here. It's called, let me expand this out again. I think it's called For the Love of Painting. And it's an extension. This is made by Bane. And it's considered a palette, but the actual extension's called For the Love of Painting, I believe. And what it is a way to organize your palette so that you can create your own shortcuts for different assets that you might use. So I'm going to go ahead and click Add Category. I'm going to edit this. I'm just going to call it, I'll say Campaign, or maybe it's spell tokens or something, whatever it is that you need. So I'll say assets just for now. Okay, once I do that, I'm going to click on there. Here's assets. Now I can click on add a new thing. So this is like a little palette. And what it will do is allow you to stage any of the assets that you want. So maybe you want to add trees or something like that. So if I'm in the assets area, I can do all my searching ahead of time before I even start building anything. So I might just say, let's say I wanted some animated trees. Maybe that's not a good search term. I'll just say trees. There's probably a lot of trees, but nonetheless. So then here's the map pack. This has this is the Fantasy Grounds Settlements map pack. So if I click on that, here's some various trees. So if I wanted to add these to the campaign map, I can drag these onto this area and stage them up. And you just do that when you get most of all the different things that you want to use on your map. Then you close the asset window and work from here. and you can actually shortcut this. So if you're in the middle of building a map, instead of having to go into the assets, open the asset, search for something, close it, put it on the map, then keep repeating that process, it takes a long time. So I prefer to have all of these things staged up here, and then once I'm in the mode to edit, I'll go to layers, and then let's say I want to use these bushes here, so I can put that in this layers tab under the tiles. Make sure I have it in tile mode, and then drag and drop it on here. And this is going to be a 1x1 tile. So as you can see, as I trace over, maybe I want it a little bit bigger. So before I stamp it, I'm going to change the, there we go. So maybe I want like that. So I change the dimensions before I even place it. Let's say I want to rotate it. So I can rotate it to a different orientation, and then click again to kind of give it some variation so it's not the exact same position. And this might give you, some insight on how to make this a little bit better for you. And then I'm going to go ahead and shrink it back down to 1. And then I'll place some smaller ones like around the periphery here. So you just kind of get that, that aesthetic that it looks like it's like a bunch of bushes kind of stacked up on each other. So this is a quicker way to stage up for adding things to a map, or you can also do other. This is tokens. So if you have spell tokens, let's say, or maybe just a token for a torch. So this might be useful. So I'll go back into my assets and I'll go back to tokens and drag a couple in here. So if I go back to the assets, which remember I have a shortcut, I don't have to go through here anymore because I've already collapsed that and put it away for now. I'm going to go to tokens, and then I'll search for torch because I want a token that will represent a loose torch, so something that's not being carried. And go ahead and hit enter. And here are some torches. So maybe during gameplay, I'll use this torch token thing icon as my loose kind of torch that I'm going to use in gameplay. I can drag and drop that over here into tokens. So these are assets for building maps and adding decorations and furniture and tiles. But then over here, you can have spell tokens. In this case, I'm using a token for a torch. And the reason I would do that, let's just say it's nighttime. So if I go over to the map tools and go to lighting, I'm going to change the outdoor lighting, the ambient lighting, to moonlight. So it's pretty dark, right? And I want this token available for my players since they want to, let's say they want to carry a torch around, and if they want to pass it between the players, it's kind of hard to do because you have to change the effect. So if you had a light spell or something like that, you could do that, but it's really clunky. So what I would do is first place the token on the map. And once you do that, this is actually going to be a token and not just an art asset. So let me, hold on, I didn't apply it to the right layer. So I'm going to go and actually go to layers, click on this. Oops, I'm going to click on this. There we go. So there's the token. Now you can see there's no light on it. I have to assign that, but once I do, it will act like a torch. So if I go to lighting, and you want to go to token light, and then you're going to have whatever it is highlighted. So in this case, I'm going to go with torch and click on this add light. And now this token is accessible by you and the players, and you can move this token around and it will have the light assigned to it. So that makes it a little bit more convenient if you want to like use one torch and pass it between your players, or maybe it's a situation where you want to just throw the torch down, like let's say over here, and you got enemies at the gate or something, and you want to move your tokens away from there. You can move out of the light source. That's something that may come up in play. I don't think it happens very often, but now it's a usable token for your players in this situation. You can also do it with spell tokens. If you have like a fireball or something like that, you could do that. But the thing is about that is there are other extensions that will add more functionality to it. But if you just want a base functionality where you don't care if it's automated or not, this is the way to go. And having this little palette over here, or having it set down here in your shortcuts, is so much handier than having to keep go through all this and dig it out. So this is a good way to stage up whatever you need for your campaign. So like for here would be map building, decorating, adding stuff onto the map layer. But then if you wanted tokens to use on your table, whether it be spell tokens or not, you can put those here. And it could just be NPCs that are not necessarily going to be on the combat tracker, but they're going to be in a bar. So let's say you had a bar scene and you had a bunch of patrons in there. You don't want to load up the combat tracker with 20 different NPCs. You can put one bar patron on the NPC as an NPC on the combat tracker, but then use any number of the tokens that you can move around as a digital representation of that NPC. But then you'd have a stat block to use if necessary, if you came down to combat or roleplay or whatever. So you can do stuff like that to kind of help you mitigate and control how much you're going to be putting on the combat tracker. So if you had a tavern, you have all your players, a couple bad guys, and like 7 patrons, that's going to be too much for this combat tracker. So you can add NPC tokens as just like a loose token that you can move around and such, and then only add one stat block for an average person, and maybe one other one for the bartender. You don't need to have 50 gazillion of those. The other thing you can do is like a mob. So if you had like a whole bunch of goblins, let's say, you can just have a token that shows like a swarm of goblins, and then just use one stat block that represents that horde, and just use the token for moving around strategically, but then use the stat block for your attacks and saves. So you wouldn't necessarily have to have 50 goblin entries here. You can just have one big mob, or maybe a couple mobs and a boss, let's say. So that would only be like 3 extra entries. You had like 20 goblins and the boss and the lieutenant on the combat tracker, that really puts a burden on Fantasy Grounds and your players, especially if you're playing across the internet through the network. It could be a little laggy. So just kind of managing the resources to help you with that sort of thing. So you can make a swarm NPC, and if you had several of them, you wouldn't necessarily have to have several stat blocks. You could just have one that kind of represents everything on the map. And that's kind of a I wouldn't say it's a perfect solution, but it cuts down on the burden and the memory requirements, especially if you've got like a gazillion tokens on here. When they're connected to the map and the combat tracker and character sheets and NPC stat blocks, that's where the calculations and the burden starts to add up. So you got to kind of keep that in mind. But this is a good way to kind of for lighting. I think this works really good, and especially like for something like, let's say they lit up a torch and they threw it. This is how you do it. So that's a kind of, I wouldn't say a hidden gem, but I don't think it's it may not even be useful to you depending on what rule set you're doing, but at least you have that capability. So Fantasy Grounds can accommodate for it. As clunky as it might be, it can be done. Let's see what else. So there is a world building tab here, and you can set up locations, and you can also set up your quests and your story entries, and you can link them here into into your locations and start building out your world. And I did load the extension called Player Agency, which kind of expands. That came out actually before this world option. But what this will do for you is give you more options on linking things together and sharing whatever it is that you're building in your world. I don't even know if this extension still works. I believe it does. It's still being maintained. but it is similar to this world button here where you can go with the locations, build all your locations, and then do it like in a hierarchy. So you'd have a regional section with some maps attached to it. So maybe you just add a new location and then you have sub locations, which would be all your cities or however you want to do it. And then you have a description that can be shared with your players, and then you have GM notes, and you can link things together in here too. So this gives you a little bit more world building options than before. So I don't even know if you need player agency anymore. It has a few other functions, I believe, that is a lot more useful in world building. But if you just use the world button now and you build your world and you kind of link it all through here, and you even have pictures that you can assign. So let's say this was the continent, and then you had cities, and then from there you had like, towns, and maybe in that town you've got locations like buildings. You can really drill down into it. This wasn't available actually not very long ago. I mean, this is kind of new. So if you want to do a little bit more world building, you have that option now. You don't necessarily have to do extensions anymore. Although I do have it loaded. I just haven't used it in a long time. But you essentially would have world building tools to build something similar, and that would be the player agency. And I think it gave players an opportunity to write their own notes, so that was a thing with that. So I don't know if it's still working or not, but it works similarly. So for someone who really likes to get into the campaign and all the world building stuff, that might be useful for that. I wanted to show you another functionality that's pretty neat. It goes in the story area, and depending on the rule set, there are templates, or you can make your own. So for instance, this is the D&D 5e rule set. There's a bunch of tables that this rolls on that you can build yourself. You don't have to use these, but you can use them as examples. And it's essentially just a bunch of tables. So all of these different templates create different elements of different types of templates. So for example, this event-based adventure, or we can do dungeon adventure framework. Let's do that. So what this does is it calls out different tables. That's what these brackets are. And then if you go to tables over here on the right under your campaign, you might have a gazillion different tables, but in this case, this may just be something that goes to yours. So you can make your own tables first and then use this to tie them all together. So instead of making a table that rolls on another table that rolls on another table, it's easier just to use this adventure framework, or however you want to use it. So this is going to go roll on goals, location, creator, purpose, history, main villain, and it has all these sub things. So these are all tables that are set up to roll with one click. So if I click generate, that's now going to give me a framework, or like an outline for what I'm going to be doing in my next adventure, especially if you do like a hex crawl, or if you do like a random, where you just want to play and kind of have a really quick idea. So this is the main villain is undead with any agenda. Main villain scheme is power. You can go through and edit these, of course, and you can change this up a little, but this gives you a starting point. But if you want it to be custom, or you want it to be kind of key to your world, you'll have to make your own tables. But this is a good way to kind of generate content depending on what you want it to do. Now, there is a lot more functionality to this I'm not showing. They can really get fancy, where you can roll on the result of another table that rolled on another table. So you can really get in depth, and there's some extensions out there that kind of advance and add to this functionality, so you get really complex. This is just kind of a basics, and these templates come with the Dungeon Master's Guide. There's some in Tasha's, and I believe in Xanathar's guide there's more tables, and you can also do this for treasure kind of and that sort of thing. So this is not necessarily for encounters and treasure tables, but you could do it here. But this is more or less for like world building, one shots. This is like an outline. So with something like this, I could take the text from here And let's just say here are, I'm going to take all of the text from this. And if you use an AI generative tool, maybe use ChatGPT or whatever it is that you know how to use. You can take something like this, and I'll just say design a one-shot adventure using the text below. So what I'm going to do is take what was generated from the outline and just use this. Use something like this. And then take this and we'll refine it. We'll add more stuff. So the adventures of the sunken shrine of Sarnath. So it's going to add a little bit more detail. So this would work really good, like with a hex crawl or something, where you don't really have anything defined, and you're just, just trying to get a kind of a starting point or whatever it is. So these are just some of the things that you might use, and I'll just take this information and put this back into Fantasy Grounds in a story entry. And then this will give me a starting point for another adventure. So I don't really need that anymore. So maybe go to stories, maybe make my own category so I can keep it separate from everything else. So we'll just say hex crawl or something like that. And I'll go ahead and hit the edit button. And here's my new section, create a new story. And let's do this. So Control V as in Victor. And I can right click and clean up the text so it takes away all those extra spaces if you don't want that. And then we could take this title, put that up here. And then do some formatting if we wanted to. So I'm just using some of the Fantasy Grounds shortcuts to kind of tidy this up. And then for my prep session, I'd go through and build the assets. So you obviously have a villain here. There's some NPCs. Now I would just take the time, if I had the time, to go through and build these out. So maybe none of this stuff is ready yet, so I could go through here and take these ideas and even change them if I needed to. So this is just something that that you can do to speed things up for you, especially if you run off the seat of your pants, you don't run adventures that are published. This might be helpful for that. So there's some really good functionality in Fantasy Grounds. It's quite elusive if you don't need it or you don't use it. And I think that Fantasy Grounds has a lot of good function in it, but it just doesn't get used very much because either A, it's kind of embedded into the interface, or it doesn't come up in gameplay. So you won't know it's there until you need it, until you start looking for it. But then even then, you may not know it exists already. So there are some things that, it comes down to experience and how much you use the platform. I didn't use most of this stuff, to be honest with you. I think I might have used the message of the day a couple times. I mean, I've used the pets and the palette extension once in a while. And then that, the table generator, I never use that for my game. So I usually just end up writing it. So, there's some great features and functionality, but you're really not going to know they're there unless you need it. And that's the thing, is it depends on how you play, how much prep you want to do, all that stuff. But I recommend that when you first start, to not worry about all this stuff necessarily at the beginning. I want you to consider maybe just getting a published adventure and using that initially, getting an idea of where everything is over here in the menu. So that's part of the journey here with learning Fantasy Grounds, is just knowing what all these things are over here. These might be things that you don't need or you might need, it depends. So I loaded this How Orcus Stole Christmas, and here's the reference manual. And you just come down here and you can go through and read this and run the adventure from here and not have to build all that stuff out, because that's a lot of work. So this is something that I recommend you do first before you really start drilling too far down into it. But this is just, some tips, some ideas. Occasionally, if the adventure is older, you might see this here, this where it has these boxes. So this adventure was probably done before Unity. So it affects quotes, apostrophes, that sort of thing, because they changed the text requirement. So it used to be one format, now it's ISO, whatever, compliant. So usually like quotes, apostrophes, that sort of thing, you'll see these weird little boxes in here, and that should be like quotes, or it should be like a hyphen or something like that, and it's not. So if you see that in older adventures, that might just be because of that. See, here's one that just shows a box instead of an apostrophe. So that just happens to be the differences in the older modules and the newer content. So if you got an old module from like the DM's Guild or something that was made for Classic, you might see that occasionally. It's usually not game breaking. You can go in and edit, but again, that's just stuff that you're not going to know until you start using Fantasy Grounds, and it takes a bit to get used to all these little features. And having a couple utility extensions is okay, I think. I mean, in my opinion, you can tell me to shut up if you want, but I think that just keeping it minimal and simple is way easier to do than trying to juggle everything at once. Because once you start adding all this other stuff, it just adds a lot of labor and work to your load. You kind of have to build to that. If you want to add extensions and your own maps and all that stuff, it's going to take some effort, practice, time, and if you're not using Fantasy Grounds enough, you're not going to learn that stuff very easily. It's going to take longer for it to sink in. You're going to be struggling with stuff and trying to do sound and then trying to do all this other stuff. It's going to drive you nuts. So take some good advice from people out there that have used the platform. They'll usually tell you don't add a bunch of stuff, and that's a real thing. It's a true statement. As annoying and frustrating as that is, try to keep it in stride and use the platform. That's really what this comes down to. If you don't use it, you're going to lose it. And it's really easy to forget. Like, I haven't touched Fantasy Grounds in over a week because I was working. I've already kind of fallen behind. Like, I don't know all the changes that were made. I don't know if some of my extensions are going to break. I haven't even gone on the forums and looked. So that's another thing, is kind of keeping up with the pulse of the community. And that's not always easy if you got a busy life. So I recommend, if you're not able to put the effort in or the time, just use published adventures. That cuts out like 70% of the work. You don't even have to mess with all that other stuff. And then just kind of get used to characters and how they function, and get it set up, get your table set up the way you want it. And just remember, every time you open up a new window, it's always in the center. So if I go to locations, when I first open this up, it's going to open up right in the middle. So like skills, right in the middle. But once you move it and you place it somewhere and you move the framework around, if I click on that again, it's going to be right here. So that's probably the biggest takeaway that in almost every video I talk about that. When you open a window for the first time, it's always going to be smack dab in the center. That's just the default behavior. Once you know that, you'll know to move it. So like, for instance, these character sheets, I always put them over here, and when I need them, they're right where I want it to be. That way I don't have to mess around. Same thing with the NPCs. I'll take those records. You see it open in the middle. So I'm going to take that record and stack it over here with the player character sheet. And then when I need it, I don't have to worry about it popping up right over my map or whatever I'm working on at the time. Because that's annoying, and it kind of cuts away from the GM's time. So if you do this ahead of time, before your campaign starts or before your session, now when you actually go to this for the wolf's turn, you can click on that and it brings us up to the top. And then now when I go to advance the turn, I can click on this link and it brings it up to the top. So that's a good way as a GM to manage your character sheets. Or if you're a player that has the NPC and the character, you can stack them up that way too. This way you don't have to have them across the screen, because that takes up a lot of real estate. So it's nice to have a little pile of deck of cards here and then just go down the list as you need them. Anyways, I think I rambled enough, and hopefully some of the stuff helps. More like tips and some things that Fantasy Grounds can do that we may not know or might not even use it, but at least there's some functionality in there. A couple of things that I added are not native to Fantasy Grounds, such as the pets, the palette where I staged all the assets that I want to use for campaigns. This is an extension, and then the locations is new, and that kind of, I wouldn't say it takes over, but it kind of replaces or the need to load up the player agency extension. But if you want to still use that, I don't see any reason why you can't. So anyways, you guys take care. Take advantage of the sale. It goes on till Tuesday, 10 a.m. Pacific time. It could be later in the afternoon if you're in Europe or East Coast, but nonetheless, take advantage of it because it's a pretty good deal. Hey, Thelgor, happy holiday, dude. So yeah, this is just a kind of a tips, what if, things that you might have forgotten about that you haven't used in a while, that sort of thing. I think next time I do a thing, I'll do some more Pathfinder 2 stuff that's related to this. A lot of it comes down to just using the platform. Just use it. That's really what it comes down to. And I know that's easier said than done, because now that I have a job, I don't have enough time to go through a lot of this stuff anymore. So my videos are going to go to probably once a week. I was doing them almost daily for a while there. But now that I've got a full-time job, I got to kind of balance that with family life and stuff. But nonetheless, you still have all the old videos, and I'll be making new ones as I can. So take care, everyone. Have a good holiday. I'll see you around next time. Bye-bye.